If you're south of I-4 and you're in Swiftmud, you're in the SWCA, the Southern Water Use Caution Area. And that has some very different and specific rules to that area, and we'll go through some of those. And the one that I want to concentrate on today is one of the, I believe, my own personal opinion, the least understood by growers, and one of the most complex, to be honest. Okay, it's a unique issue, and it's the credits, conservation credits. What does that mean, and over pumpage and everything else. So I'm going to go through this, and it is going to involve some minor math, but as I go through it, I'll go through it slow. And that's why I've given you handouts. And if anybody's got any questions on anything that I've got today, okay, I've got cards, just call me, okay? It's all free. I'm trying to disperse information so that people understand it. And so you can be, my goal really is for growers to become self-regulating on some aspects of this, so they understand. And before I start, when I first did my big overpumpage projects when I was at the district, I was a permit evaluator, and they said, these are your compliance cases. You must go out and handle these. A lot of them were overpumpage. I would go to the grower and I'd say, I'm sorry, it looks like you may be overpumping. And he goes, that's impossible. How did you come up with that? And I said, it was your data. It's what you submitted. Okay, it's your information. So understanding that information of those meter readings that you send in on a month-by-month basis, that's where it gets generated. So understanding what those things mean is key. And as we go through water use, it really behooves everybody to kind of watch those things really on a month-by-month basis, but that's entirely up to each individual. But if you do get into a non-compliance issue in the future, based on the information and some of the stuff I'm going to tell you, you will know what's happening. You'll have a much better understanding on what is transpiring. Okay, the SWCA. I'm not going to go back to the beginning of the SWCA and everything else, but if you look at the very first page, it talks about water conservation credits within the SWCA. And I'm not going to go through all of this, and this is from the basis of review. Okay, this is directly from the district's website. And so this is from the Water Use Permit Basis of Review, or VOR. And you see this initial credits and earned credits and carry forward credits, and you're like, what the heck is that? Okay. Well, we're going to get into that. First time anybody saw credits, if you'll turn the page, this is an example from the file of record, okay? A lot of people got these in the end of 2002 or at the beginning in January 2003. So you got a letter. Everybody that grows agricultural crops, okay, and within the SWCA, and specifically those that they're not plasticulture, okay, not like a row crop guy, or some of the nursery people and everything, those that actually receive effective rainfall. So your trees are out in the open, so you get effective rainfall. You were captured by this, and all of a sudden you got this letter where the district modified everybody's permit by rule. They have that ability. So across the board, everybody that qualified for this got modified. And again, this says, I've highlighted November 4th, 1994, the District Governing Board approved new rules for the Southern Water Use Caution Area and Area of Stressed Water Resources. Okay? And if you'll flip the page, what does all that mean? That's the first time you saw it. It's highlighted right here. Credits. Initial credits in gallons. If you look at it, I've highlighted it in yellow up here at the top. So in the midst of this letter that you received, where they modified your permit, they also gave you an initial credit balance. Okay? And does everybody see what I'm talking about right up here on this letter? Okay? So you, as well as just about everybody, went, what does that mean? What do these credits mean? Even if you read the letter and understood it, it may be very difficult to understand what were the credits. That was your beginning balance in your water use checking account. Right there. Gallons. Okay? So you have your permit, you're riding along and doing a lot of things, but this is, and again, everybody's credits would be different. Depends on the size, depends on your permit. Everyone was basically customized, theoretically, for your particular permit. So now let's go to the next page that we've got, which is AgMod. This is the output from AgMod. We ran this morning. This is the program that the district developed. Doesn't really stand for anything other than agricultural model. It uses a modified Blaney-Criddle equation to come up with the supplemental irrigation quantities that you need. This is how the permitted quantities on your permit are developed. Almost all. There are some aspects outside of AgMod, but for 99.9%, this is how they get done. Either you run it, or a consultant runs it, or the district runs it. But this is where your quantities come from. You enter in some pretty basic things. This I've highlighted, citrus. Okay, you got to put the crop type. You put in the irrigation system. What is it? And in this case, low volume spray. Microjet type spray. It has menus, so you can drop down and put all those things in. You've got to put in the soil. I just stuck in my ACCA over here. All right, you put in the soil type. I put in, this is a 100-acre growth. I put in 100 acres, and I just maxed it out. I put 10,000 GPM. So it's like I got 3 or 4 wells on my 100 acres. All right, and you run this, and it shows it's going to irrigate for 365 days, or in this case it says 364, IFA's 365. It's just it's going to give you a year's worth. And so this is how your quantities get generated. So you look down at this, and I've highlighted it again. You see this, and so it gives you, those are the quantities, and I can sit here for 2 hours and go through this AgMod program. I have dissected this thing. I was part of some of the people that helped develop some aspects of this. I could go through and tell you just an amazing amount of detail that goes into the development of this piece of paper. But really what spits out at the bottom is several numbers, okay? Your standard annual average, I'm going to get into what that means. Your drought annual average, your peak month, and your crop protection quantities. All of those are the result of this program. The easiest is your crop protection. That's based on your pump capacity. You put in 10,000 GPM, it has a certain threshold that it'll take it up to, that IFA's recommendation on the amount of crop protection that's needed for 100 acres, that's what it gives you, right there. If it's less than the recommended amount, it'll say limited by system capacity. So it's telling you, hey, you don't have enough water to run all your microjets. Those numbers are pretty good, actually, on the amount of GPM you need per acre, per irrigation, per the type of emitter you may have. But if you don't put in blue heads or green heads or anything like that, it doesn't have any of that detail. Okay, it just makes some assumptions on the irrigation. So that comes up. But the other ones is where there's a lot more detailed work. The standard annual average, let me back up a little bit. Your permits, typically they used to last from 6 to 10 years. That was kind of the time frame. Now we're into 20 years. A lot of permits. If you're not aware, if you're in compliance, you can actually ask for a 20-year permit. So, but everything was pretty much set up on a 10-year window. And 10 years is a convenient time frame mathematically, okay? It just is. It's an easy number to work with. So in this program, they've actually taken, in each county, that's why you put the county in there, they look at rainfall records. Fortunately, these records are not completely up to date, but it's long-term, 80 years, 75 years from like Arcadia. Okay, so it's going to be a long-term record of rainfall. Based on that long-term record of rainfall, they statistically calculate what is the driest 2 years that could occur out of the 10-year window, okay? And basically then also what is the 5 and 10 or normal conditions. Okay, so it looks at that rainfall records and looks at, okay, when is it, what is the driest amount of rain or the least amount of rain that we're going to get during a certain time frame, 20% of the time, or 2 out of 10, okay, that could occur over that entire time frame, statistically looking at it. And then it's what are normal conditions, basically. So then AgMod gives you irrigation quantities on top of rainfall. Okay, so rainfalls, so God gave you, that's the basic. We're looking at a dry condition and a normal condition. And then it's, okay, based on the crop coefficients of what citrus needs or whatever crop you use in this, you're going to need additional water. That additional water to irrigate is what your permit is based on. The standard annual average is the 5 and 10, or the way I like to say it, the 1 out of 2, or normal conditions. So that's for normal rainfall. And I won't go into whose definition of normal is, okay, on rainfall. But mathematically, that's the value. The drought annual average is, again, and these are annual quantities, is based on a very dry year, okay, the drought quantity. Okay, it's all making sense. The peak month is another number, and I'm not going to go too much into it, but the peak month is also on the front of your permit. During the driest time of the year, even on a normal year, in May or April, you guys gotta use a lot more water because it's ET is very high, conditions are high, everything's like that. So typically water use is low during the rainy season and it starts ramping back up during the dry season. So it has kind of a wave pattern to it. That peak during the dry season is your peak month quantity. So basically what we do is you kind of dissect statistically rainfall occurrences on a kind of a year-by-year basis, and then you dissect a year to look at the driest time within that dry year, which is the peak month. So I know but those are the quantities that are associated with your permit. So now I'm going to kind of push the peak month away, and I'm going to look at the standard annual average and the drought annual average. And again, if you look down here, conservation credits, it gave, if you look under inches, it says 5.8 inches. Then it has gallons, 14,092,100. And then if you look, then they've calculated, that's total gallons, that's just a total gallon amount. And then you see on gallons per day, GPD, so they've just divided it by 365. And then next to it in red, it says initial credits, 11.6. Now how did they get that? It's 2 times the 5.8, okay? So, before we go, and I'll back up and go back through this if you'd like me to. We have 2 quantities based on rainfall frequency. Our 5 and 10, our standard annual average, and our 2 and 10, the drier time, our drought annual average. Okay, those 2 quantities will appear in your permits, okay? And then we have this thing called credits. Credits is the gallons between those 2 values. Okay? That's the difference between the 2 values. Your standard or normal condition, just think of it as a flat line. Let's just say it's 15 inches per year. That's it. Let's just say it's 15 inches. That's all you're going to get for your standard. And let's say your drought is 18 inches. That handles the dry year. The 3 inches in between them, if you calculate that to gallons, that's how you get your credits. Now the district gives you 2 years worth of credits, okay? So your permit is really regulated upon the lower number, the 5 and 10, okay? In this case, I was using the 15 inches. That's your permit amount. You have this ceiling up here that's 3 inches higher, a little bit the drought number, but they only give you, or what they allocate to you, is 2 years worth of gallons to reach that higher level. So if you think about it, your water use, I'll just say that, I'm just going to theoretically talk about a 10-year window. You're rocking along in normal conditions, it starts drying up, your water use goes up. Theoretically, it can go up for 2 years. It doesn't have to be 2 years back to back, but it could, I'm just using this as a simple example. It would ramp up for 2 years, up to that drought time frame. As conditions went back to normal, it would drop back down. So 8 out of the 10 years, using this example, you'd be down at the 15-inch level. 2 out of the 10 years, you could be up at the 18. But now, we know weather doesn't work that way. Nothing works that nice and neat. I don't care what the numbers you do and everything else. It's up and down, year by year, or different parts of the year and everything else. And that's okay. This just says, I'm going to give you a total balance of gallons that you can draw upon during your permitted time frame when you're above that standard annual average. So it gives you an account to pull from, all right? Here's kind of the I did a simple calculation of how you do it, okay? So from AgMod, I had 100 acres of citrus. Another aspect on AgMod is, when you put in 100 acres, it doesn't give you 100 acres worth of water. They assume that 10% of the area basically is not irrigated, it's the middles and everything else, the grassed area. So when you put in 100 acres, it automatically drops you down to near 90, right off the bat. So you're not getting 100 acres worth of water, you're getting 90 acres worth of water. So if I put in 100 acres of citrus, and I put in 100 acres, minus the 10%, got 90 acres, okay? If you remember my ag mod example that I had before, it said my initial credits was 5.8 inches. Okay, sounds good. If you multiply by 2 for the 2 years that they give you by rule, 11.6. Okay, so that's your total bank account for your permit term. So let's just stick with 1 year right now. If I take 5.8 inches, multiply it by 27,154, and you're like, what the heck is that? That is a constant, and that is a conversion to gallons per acre inch. That's how you convert inches to gallons. You've got to use this factor to get there. So you multiply it by, every time when you're converting inches to gallons over a certain area, you use that number, okay? So 5.8 inches times 27,154, gallons per acre inch, that's the unit, times 90 acres equals 14,174,388 gallons, okay? Just multiply that by 2, or do 2 years worth of credits, you got 28,348,776. So that's how your balance, that's for this 100-acre grove, using this, that's what they would start with right there. That is, in my example, the balance that they have. So again, when you pump your permit, and you submit pumpage every month, okay? And we're gonna go through how that gets analyzed. It's all mathematics. When you submit that, they monitor that value, it's all done via computer, and they look at it, and the moment that you come above that 5 and 10, or standard annual average, okay? And if it's above that value, it subtracts automatically from your credit balance. Okay, so there's not only your pumpage going along, there's also a tracking of your credit balance going along through time. So there's 2 things that are being monitored as you go along. So when it's really wet and you're pumping below your 5 and 10, almost everybody did during 2004, 2005. I mean, it hurricanes. People gained credits. It's the only way you get more other than renewing, getting a brand new permit, which may be in 10 or 20 years, depending on the term of your permit. But during that time frame, during wet conditions, and you pump less than the 5 and 10, less than average conditions, or consumption of water for irrigation, you gain credits. When you're pumping above it, you subtract them. So that balance is changing literally. They were doing it once per year, and Swiftmud was, and you weren't getting, if you weren't submitting your crop reports, remember those things you got to get in? Annual crop reports? Everybody that's in the SWCA that's got a permit of a certain size has to submit crop reports on a per well basis. Every well has to have a crop report. And so if you're not submitting your crop reports, but you're pumping below the 5 and 10, they're not going to give you credit for it. So, free advice of the day. If you have a condition on your permit that says submit a crop report, you got to get them in. It is incumbent upon you to get them in and get them in right.
That's in the SWCA.
That's in the SWCA, right?
Everything. All in the SWCA and Peace River.
Exactly right. So that's in the SWCA. You've got to get your crop reports in. Okay, and it's 1 time per year. It's annual, and I think they're due by April 1 on most conditions.
This month, right?
Yeah. So it's coming up.
They don't notify you anymore about
It's a condition on your permit, man.
Okay.
And it's plugged into their computer, and when you don't do it, a letter's going to pop out to you and say, "Hey, lack of submittal of data." So they will remind you after the fact that it didn't come in. But a lot of people, I have a lot of citrus clients, a lot of guys are really busy, and for whatever happens, it may be another ad, I don't know what happens, but sometimes they can't get that in. It is key to get that number in. There's several things I'm gonna tell you today. Getting the crop report in is key. That is absolutely key. And once you've done it, once you've set it up and done it, it's really pretty simple, to be honest. It's not too bad because you're an annual crop. I mean, typically your area is not changing a lot with greening or canker or something you may be pushing. So I mean, but in the past there's been giant swaths taken out, obviously, but those acres need to be supplied to the district, okay? On a per well basis. You got 4 wells, you'll have 4 crop reports. So it has to be on each well. Guys out on these numbers, but this is the world that I live in. When you submit your pumpage, you submit it every month, okay? And you're thinking, okay, that's what I pumped. Those pumpage values go in and there's 12 of them, okay, for 12 months, theoretically. And that's why they want you to do them at a regular interval near the beginning, or certainly near the very beginning, but near the end of the month. So that it represents pretty much an even segment of time of about 30 days between each value that you've done. You take 12 of those values, okay? If I just had 12 of them, but you've been pumping for a long time, so you get a lot more, but if you just had 12, you would take those 12 values, add them up, get the total gallons, okay, and divide that by, at that point, 365 to get the average gallons per day. Remember, gallons per day is how SwiftMud works. So when you submit your pumpage, you give them a month's worth, okay? That's what you're submitting to them. They then look at that, add up the 12, look at it for a year, divide it by the 365 of sorts, and then what is that value, and compare it to your permit. Now they do that every month, so it becomes a moving annual average that moves through time. So each time you add a month drops off, so that it is a moving window of pumpage. So then you get to this graph. This is what your pumpage data will look like. This is actual pumpage data. This is what we do. Immediately when I get a call, when I was at the district and when I do it as an evaluator, and I'm not an evaluator anymore, but this is the format that I've been doing now for almost 20 years. I gather all of the monthly data that comes in from people over a long period of time, and I analyze it. And so this is kind of as an example. This is not from the district, this is from me, okay? But what they do mathematically is very, very similar. You see in here, you see the dates along the bottom. You see on the left-hand side, gallons per day. That's the units that we're dealing with, GPD, okay? You see all these blue bars that are there. That's the monthly submittal of pumpage, okay? So that's what was submitted to the district. All of these blue bars that are in here. Those are the gallons. So when you submit water for 1 month, you divide it by the days in the month, and that's how you get a blue bar right there. That's your peak month. That's the amount. You can see there's some real peaks on here, some real high values, and you can see other values. And if you look in there, you'll see during the rainy season it's pretty low, and some other aspects. And also if you look, sometimes during the winter time, you see some really tall ones. I mean, look at that one. This is like way up, okay? I'm going to get to that one in a little bit. This is another free advice about submittal of information. You see the two lines? You see a black dash line? That's the drought annual average. So that's the quantity that you see right there, okay? You see the red one is a standard annual average. The reason I made it red is that's your permitted quantity. Your credits are in between there, okay? 2 years worth. The green line that you see here is the moving annual average. So I've statistically taken 12 months and moved through time, and you can see that line rocks along, doing its thing, and then you'll see in February of 2013, it ramped up and crossed the red line. You cross the red line in this plot, credits are being burned. Okay? They're taking away credits. If you went above the black line, you're over permitting, you're over pumping period. Okay, so if you had credits and you went above the drought, you're over pumping. If you have no credits and you went above the red, you're over pumping. So credits are really important, obviously, because there could be 3 inches or more of water use in between there, okay? And if you don't have those 3 inches to rely upon during a dry situation, now you're over pumping. So now look at these real tall spikes. When I analyze that and I look at the time of year, I'm like, man, that doesn't make sense. Crop protection. That shows when you take a meter reading at the end of this month and end of the next month, and during that time frame, you had to use it for frost freeze protection, okay? And you didn't send in your crop protection form showing, that's another thing you gotta do, on the amount of water that you have used on a per well basis solely for crop protection. Again, it could be 90% of the month could have been standard irrigation, but those couple of days that you used it, I mean, face it, we're trying to protect the trees, man. We're wide open, man. We're trying to save our livelihood. Man, that's the night that counts right there. So you open it up. But if you don't report that crop protection, the computer just thinks it's part of your annual average. It just says, hey, that's reported pumpage. Second free advice, beyond crop reports, get in the frost freeze and crop protection report. If you don't, it's now embedded in your pumpage. Okay? It is now being part of the calculation. And it is now your burning credits. So that's, and it can have a fairly abrupt, if you look at that green line, look where it was rocking and rolling, and then that peak hit, bam, man, it jumped up dramatically. Then, a couple of other events probably occur, but I'm into May, now I'm into the dry time. If you look at these smaller bars right next to it, so what happens, okay, statistically, and everything that I do with pumpage, I've got really a lot of water used for cold protection, okay? December, January, February, maybe even in March, okay? What is that followed by? Your highest water use, the dry season. So you have got to pay, crop protection is key and is probably one of the most common aspects for overpumpage, is the lack of crop protection reporting. So you've got to get that in too. You got to get that in so that it gets subtracted out of this mathematical, because again, you submitting these things and you're doing it online, so now you're submitting all your data right online, you know what I mean? You guys are doing it, hopefully a lot of you guys are doing it. You're entering the numbers right into the mainframe and it's just doing this. It's not making a pretty graph just like this, but this is what it's doing. This is exactly what it's doing. The moment your water use gets above the annual average, okay, you're 5 and 10 or normal, you're burning credits. And now they are sending out letters to say, like I just showed you, you're burning credits. So now let's, after that long-winded explanation, let's go back to the letter of potential non-compliance. Look at the second paragraph. It would be necessary to provide a written explanation within 15 days. So when you get this letter, you got 15 days to reply to the district. I usually get the call on day 9 or 10 from people. Okay, so you're busy. I know how it is. Believe me. Okay, so you've got that. They have given. If you read this, and again, you can look through it again. This is a form letter. Okay, at least at this time it was. So this is what everybody would get. It's not specific to my client. They plug in the numbers, but this would be a form letter. They're asking for documentation of specific diseases or conditions from an expert. In other words, is this due to greening? Is that why you're using more water? Okay. And if so, they're asking for documentation in regards to that as part of your response. Okay, so they're asking about that. And they actually give you some information on where you can send the stuff, your leaves and other things to get information, but they don't want just one, at least the letter, to say, hey, I've got greening. They want evidence of greening. Then you look at this, the other highlighted paragraph. If overpumpage indeed occurred, the conditions of the permit have been violated. Efforts to bring the quantities into compliance must begin as soon as possible so that a pumpage reduction can be measured during the first full month of pumpage measured after the date of this letter. That is a real tough one, okay? And in my world, in the mathematics of this graph, remember, it's 12 months that you're adding together and dividing by 365. It reacts very slowly. It's a 12-month average. If you're to drop within 1 month, you've got to cut your pumpage, depending on where you're at, to the bone, to drop it. So the mathematics of the moving annual average are difficult. They're slow to climb, and unless you got one of these giant peaks, okay? But they're just as slow to recede. If you go back to just normal, so you think, wait a minute, okay, I hear you. I understand what I got to do. I'll back off, and then you back off. But depending on where you are at on this graph or these lines, it may have to be a substantial reduction to deflect that line down lower and drop you below that value. So that can be depending on where you're at, and that's why it's incumbent on everybody to kind of understand this pumpage. because that could be very difficult, okay? So then they give you some answers on this, review the accuracy of the meters that have been used, and that's why the district is very, I mean, they want you to analyze your meters, okay? Every 5 years, you're required to certify under conditions of your permit to get your meters recalibrated. I just did a ton of them. We just got involved in a bunch. It was a bad bunch. Half of the ones that we did were out of compliance. Swift Mud's 5%. If it's 5% off, I don't know what's going to happen under CupCon. South Florida, 10%. So I don't know what's going to happen on the meter accuracy right now, but Swift Mud and your permit is based on 5%. 5%. And so the older meters that may not have been installed right, and I can tell you, if you go up to your meter, there's a lot of condensation inside of it, or the cap is missing, or you got a crack in the lens. I see them every day. Most likely, that may be a sign that there's internal wear on the impeller, and that it may not be reading accurately. To replace a meter, we just replaced a bunch, $1,300 a piece, 10-inch line. So it's not cheap. And I got a client's got to do 6 of them. So watching your meters and doing that is key. That's a heavy hit. Okay, so that's not something that's and some of these are non-standard pipe size. The bigger your diameter of your main line, the higher the meter cost. So 8-inch or 4-inch or 6-inch versus a 16-inch main, that's 16-inch would be more. That's a 10-inch main that I just told you about, $1,300. So it gives you kind of and I shopped around at 3 different firms to do it. So anyway, so getting your meters and having them accurate is really key on what you're doing it. And the district, again, before I continue, as you get one of these letters, probably the first thing to do when you get this is go, okay, what's going on? But you could call the district, their first letter to kind of contact them is to find out what it is. And you need to understand where your pumpage is in relationship to the notice. In other words, are you out of credits? Or are you above that 2 and 10? Or what is the situation that you have this? And I hope that I've kind of helped on some of that. But let's...
David, do you know how far back you can go and report cold protection?
It's different on
pumpage?
every case, okay? And I'm going to get into that, okay? So now this, if you turn the page one more time, this is from the file of record. This is an actual pumpage record that's gone through for somebody. And this is the district spreadsheet, not mine, okay? This is theirs where they're going through and calculating it. And if you notice, it goes all the way back to 2003. So if your initial credits were given to you, as I showed you in 2003, you're taking that with you all the way. This was for 10 years. So for 10 years. So to analyze some of these issues, you may have to go back as far as 10 years to analyze where you're at. Okay? So it can be difficult. They've been very open in working with them on trying to do the crop protection, but like anything, it's a whole lot easier to report it up front when it happened rather than going back and going, I don't know how many, when and how, or how much, or how long, or whatever. And you can look at weather records and everything else, but again, the district, you're permitted to do these things. I mean, it says in your permit that you must submit your monthly pumpage, that you must submit the crop reports, that you must submit the amount of crop protection that you've used. So you're bound by this permit to do those things, some on months, some annually, but that's the time to do it, is to keep up with it. And so that you don't have to go back in time. We've had to go back several years, and I can tell you, if it's beyond a year, it gets very difficult with the district and to try to figure out what that crop protection use was. So to answer your question, so credits are a big deal. They last a long time. as long as 10 years or more, depending on what it is. 20-year permits, obviously, could last longer. I'm working on an issue with the district right now in regards to that, to longer term. But now, what do you do with all this stuff? I mean, how do you do this? The last page that I got, this is not marketing by any means, okay? But this is what I do. And if you want to understand your permit, above everything else, this is what you would have to do. This only shows, this spreadsheet is about this wide, if I printed it at this size. It's got every well, all the months, throughout the period of record. We sum all wells to total gallons. Do you see that right to the the first column? So that's the total gallons that have been used for all the wells on a given month. You see the number of days in the month. We divide it by the number of days and we get the gallons per day. That's your peak month right there. That's those blue bars that you just saw on that plot. That's how you get the blue bars. Then you see the next one in yellow is the moving annual average, okay? If you counted those blank spots right there, and I think I printed it right, you don't start, you have to add up 12 of them, and boom, now that's the average of those 12 readings, and then we take the average of a bracketed 12 months through time. That's where you see those numbers, okay? So that's the moving annual average, okay? This is done in Excel. The next column is the permitted amount, 210, 600. That's the 5 and 10. You see at the top it says permitted standard annual average. Next to that is the drought annual average at 298, 500. If you follow down the moving annual average to where I've highlighted it, you'll see at the very first one says that I've highlighted says 217,065 gallons. That's higher than the number to the right at 210. We're burning credits, okay? But we're below the 298, 500. So we're in a credit burning mode, not in a straight over pumpage. If we had crossed the 298, 500, we're over pump. Okay? But right now we're burning credits. So we put those numbers into our spreadsheet. Then I put a calculator in. I write a little algorithm, a little simple little logic statement. So for my clients, so when they put in permit compliance status, if you look at it, it says it's just makes it real simple. You don't have to look at the numbers. It says below standard, below standard, below standard. Right where we cross, boom, above standard. Okay, so it tells you you're above your standard annual average on your moving annual average. So all you do is you enter in your monthly pumpage and copy the formulas down. All this is done automatically. That's how we do it. So we do this every month. So then you look to the right of that, you see credits change. Okay, so if I'm below the standard, I'm adding credits. If I'm above it, the credits, I'm burning credits. Okay. So then we go through and I look at my annual sum of gallons. And so I'm not looking at gallons per day. I'm looking at my total gallons that I burned in a year. I'm comparing that to my credit balance. And you get that final column of the credit balance status as my calculator does. Credits are added, boom, credits are subtracted. Okay, so now I make this so simple that people can immediately tell by they put in their pumpage values what's happening to my credits. What did I do? What happened? Did I add them? Did I subtract them? What did I do? It tells you. Then I've added one more thing. I have a credit balance. And this one was $77,659,970. Remember that 2003 letter or 2002 letter that said, here's your credit balance, okay? If you analyze all the way back to 2003, you can track your balance through all those years and get to this time frame and say, what's my balance? What do I got? In this case, that's what I had. And so what I do then, and this is my crazy, I try to take it so many steps further. I then say, this last column here, if I have a calculator that says, if I continue to use water at the same rate as this month that I just added, if you look at that, it says you got 18.3 months left at that rate. But then we kept climbing. It went down to 6.1 months. So our water use kept going. So as our water use increased, the amount of months that I could burn at that rate shrunk. I'm using them faster. But then we reduced our pumpage, and you see it increased into 7.7. So what I do is I've added a predictor line that tells me how far out in advance and months I have credits left based on my latest water use number that I put in. Hopefully, these numbers then, during the dry season, the amount of months left will shrink. Hopefully during the wet season, which is what when we get into the wet season, you'll see those, your water use will go down and the length of credits will extend. This way, you guys, my clients are well ahead of that letter. Months ahead. They're well ahead. And if you see it all of a sudden go from 18 months to like 2 months, you're like, man, there's something wrong here. What did I do? I put in too much, or where's my crop protection? This spreadsheet that's real wide, that here that I didn't show, it has the pumpage of the well, and then each well we subtract the reported crop protection each month that's been done. So we take care of that before we get to this total gallons right here. We take it out. So this is what a very accurate accounting of credits looks like. Okay? So credits are a big deal. They're tough. It is something the district was looking at them at once per year, I believe. They're getting to this once a month. I mean, it's real simple to do. You just do what I just did. I mean, literally, it's easy to write some computer code that looks at your balance every month. So based on this long-winded mathematical lecture here, I guess the bottom line, if I can think about it, is you need to understand your permit. You've got to read that thing. You got to get it out, blow it off, dust it. If you don't have it, go on to WMIS. You can find it very easily. You can download it as a PDF. Okay. You can also see any of your non-compliance, okay, value, any reports that you've got, all their letters, everything's right there. Okay. So know your permit. You don't have to look at it every day, you know, but you certainly ought to look at it a couple times a year. If you're not tracking your pumpage, like what we're having to do, then you need to look at it several times a year. You know how much fuel you're burning. You know what's going on. When you're burning a lot more fuel or you're running your pumps longer, that's the time when you're entering in that data that you need a little light ought to go off in your head and say, have I submitted my crop reports? Have I submitted my crop protection? Have I got all of those allowances in there? Because if not, the computer's just going to say, hey, that's your pumpage, and that's what you did to your credits, and away you go. So we try to be proactive in this. And it's good for the district, since we're not getting into overpumpage situations, and it's good for everybody else because you see what's going on. And our spreadsheets, we plot the graph too. So you just hit a tab and there's your graph. So a lot of people just want to see that graph. You know, I mean, you got to admit, that's pretty easy you can see that trend going up and you can understand how things are working. So again, it is somewhat difficult, but once it gets set up, it's really pretty simple. And so what we tell all our clients is, before you submit online, to make sure you don't have a typo or something else, look at it yourself, understand your water use, okay? And then submit so that you understand. If you got that letter, you know what, I mean, you're being proactive, you understand it. And that goes back to how I started it when I went out to the farmer and said, hey, you're over pumping. He goes, that's impossible, I can't be doing that. I said, well, it's your data. That's what you told me you were doing, okay, by what you submitted it. And I didn't have this opportunity to sit there and go through this whole thing through them, but that's kind of how it works. So it's important, yeah.
Mine's not a question with credits. I'm curious, in the calculation on quantities on the permit,
Yeah.
does soil type come to bear on quantities?
Yeah, oh yes, very much.
And the reason I ask, you know, at least in Hardy and Soda County, this area, anything larger than 20 acres seldom has one soil type. Is there a governing as to what you use, and is it better drained soils or less drained soils that give a grower a greater likelihood of higher quantities?
Better drained soils, naturally you get higher quantities. Okay, if they water drops through quickly, so rich soils versus flatwood soils. Flatwood's going to get less. Okay, generally. You look at it, and that's an important aspect, is what were the assumptions put into AgMod? What were the assumptions? Soil type is a key number. Now, I've done it or 20 years now, you can divide your grove, depending on how big your grove is. If it's 20 acres or 10 acres, and you can look at your soil types, okay? And in GIS, the district can show you your soil types. You could ask them to maybe look at that. We do that as well. We have all their values. But we look at the predominant soil type under the growing area, and generally that's what's used. But I've also had where we had to bust it up because there was a great disparity in the types of soils. They were very different. So it depends on the case, but it does behoove you. That's a big assumption on the ag mod at the very beginning of this is, do those soil types make sense for my grow? Is that what's really there? And so that is also part of the analysis that when we get into an overpumping situation, when someone comes in, what we do is we immediately look at the soil types. What were the assumptions made under the permit? We go and look for that ag mod run in the file of record. Say, okay, it said Mayaca. Heck, it's not Mayaca, it's Candler. So we will rerun Candler and try to do it right. And if the values are very different, then we write a letter to the district and say we need to letter mod or modify our permit to get it right.
Because most growers are gonna irrigate their groves to the section, I might only have 20% Adamsville soil, but in my grove, but I'm gonna irrigate I can't isolate that, so I'm gonna irrigate my grove based on the best drained soils, and if I'm permitted for a heavier soil, it seems like it's really stacked against me.
In certain situations, it can be difficult. So knowing your permit, knowing the irrigation system is key. You've hit on, that's when we get involved, my company, when we get involved in something, an overpumping situation, somebody gets that letter and they come to us, this is exactly what we'll do. We analyze the soils, we analyze all the things that went to, and we can do it really, really quickly. We look through all that, and the district could help. We look at it and to see, were the assumptions originally on that permit correct? And oftentimes, they certainly didn't account for some of those nuances. And so you're exactly right. I have a client, this particular client, put together, he bought a lot of little groves, a lot of little ones, and put them all together on the ridge. So none of those things interact or coordinate well. They're all different soils, different everything. And so he's like, I'm not going to go run that pump for an hour and that one for 45 minutes and that one for 2 hours based on it. I can't just be running around here doing it. The same thing is kind of like your situation where you have a unified system that's very large that covers other soil types that, hey, when it comes on, there may be issues if on something like that, there may be the possibility, maybe through farms, to get some valve control or something else to try to help with those situations so that you can segregate systems if it's really a big issue. But the place to start is, what were the soils that were used? What were the irrigation coefficients associated with those soils? And if you see one's 12.2 and the other one's 12.3, that's not going to make that much difference. But if I see 12.2 and 15.1, we got to chop it up. We got to look at the permit correctly and to make sure that it's done. And that's a whole lot easier now, guys, with GIS. I used to do when I was at the district, I had to take out that planimeter. Anyone know what a planimeter is? Okay, to go through by hand on a soils map where a section's that big, blow it up to keep it to scale, and sit there and measure every one of those soil types so I could go through and do it. Every one, it'd take 2 days to go through that. In GIS, we bring up your property boundary, okay, in an aerial photograph and your property from the property appraisers group within seconds. I look at it, we delineate the growing area within seconds, we put a boundary around it, and in GIS I immediately can do all the soils within it, and what's the predominant soil type, and get a readout of all of the acres of those individual soils. Literally